Can you believe Earth once belonged to strange beings? Unlike any animal or plant that has ever existed, they ruled for tens of millions of years, then almost vanished from history. Only fossils remain, along with a mystery that has endured for hundreds of millions of years. Who were they really? Could they have been the beginning of complex life on Earth? This is the Ediacaran period, the most mysterious age in the history of life. And many species did not even exhibit bilateral symmetry, a feature that is nearly universal among modern animals. Their bodies were soft and flattened, often preserved as faint biological impressions on the seafloor. Some species displayed repeating, branching structures that resemble fractal geometry more than conventional biology. No head, no tail, no limbs, just shapes spreading across the floor of the ancient oceans. Take Dickinsonia, one of the most iconic symbols of the Ediacaran. Its body was oval-shaped, composed of repeated segments, mirrored along a central axis. Yet there is no clear evidence of a digestive cavity or internal organs. Dickinsonia ranged in size from just a few centimeters to over 1 meter, making it one of the largest multicellular organisms of its time. Then there is Charnia, an organism that looked like a giant feathered leaf anchored upright in the seafloor. Its structure consisted of continuously branching segments, each one repeating the shape of the whole, a near-perfect fractal pattern. Charnia could reach heights of up to 2 meters and lived fixed in place. Without movement, there is no evidence of a nervous system, no sensory organs. In the modern world, no animal operates in this way. Fractophusis was stranger still. Its fossils reveal a long, narrow body with symmetrical side branches like a biological fingerprint pressed into the seafloor. The spatial distribution of Fractophusis fossils suggests it reproduced through slow dispersal, possibly by fragments breaking off from the body, a strategy that is rare among animals today. When we look at fossils from this period, this has led many scientists to ask a fundamental question. These are not fish, were these truly animals in the modern sense, or a completely different form of multicellular life? Had no eyes, no mouths, no guts, no bones. One influential hypothesis proposes that many of them belong to a separate group, sometimes called Vendobionta, an evolutionary lineage that ran parallel to animals but left no descendants. In the Ediacaran world, life was not driven by intense competition, but by environmental stability. And to understand why science nearly overlooked this entire strange world, we must return to the moment when it all began, when the first fossils were discovered. And even science itself struggled to believe what it was seeing. For the Ediacaran period, that moment came in 1946 in a barren range of hills in southern Australia known as the Ediacara Hills. At the time, evolutionary biology was dominated by a nearly unshakable assumption. Complex life began in the Cambrian period. Before that, Earth was believed to be a world of bacteria, simple algae, and microscopic life forms. The first Ediacaran fossils were dismissed as geological marks, the result of mud flows, sediment cracking, or inorganic mineral structures. Others were attributed to large algae or to microbial activity unrelated to animals. The rock layers containing Ediacaran fossils were dated using uranium-lead radiometric methods, yielding ages between 635 and 541 million years ago, placing them firmly in the late Neoproterozoic, entirely before the Cambrian. This created a contradiction that could not be ignored. If these were not living organisms, why did they appear repeatedly, display consistent forms, and follow ecological patterns? At the Avalon Peninsula in Canada, Ediacaran fossils were found in ancient deep-sea sediments, preserved in remarkable detail. This shattered the idea that Ediacara was merely a local phenomenon or the product of unusual environmental conditions. Almost simultaneously, discoveries in the Nama Basin of Namibia, as well as in England, Russia, and later China, revealed the same biological forms. Soft, flattened, boneless bodies appearing across the globe. By the late 20th century, paleontologists began to recognize that Ediacaran fossils were not only similar in shape, but also displayed coherent biological structure. They appeared on ancient seafloors and were often preserved when fine layers of sand rapidly buried them after storms or sediment slides. This indicated that these organisms had lived attached or semi-attached to the substrate, rather than being randomly transported debris. The most profound shift did not come from a single discovery, but from the synthesis of global data when distribution maps were layered together. A new picture emerged, a planet-scale Precambrian ecosystem. The Cambrian explosion was no longer seen as a beginning. But as a replacement, today, Ediacara is recognized as the oldest known assemblage of multicellular organisms. But the question remains, how did they live in a world without the survival pressures we recognize today? The answer lies in the physical and chemical environment of Earth at the end of the Neoproterozoic, a world profoundly different from today's oceans. Ediacaran organisms lived primarily on shallow seafloors, where sunlight could still penetrate, currents were weak, and conditions were remarkably stable. These were not complex coral reefs, nor chaotic deep-sea trenches, but vast seafloor plains blanketed by microbial mats. Those microbial mats form the foundation of the entire Ediacaran ecosystem. Instead of hunting, most Ediacaran organisms barely moved at all. Fossils show that many species remained fixed for their entire lives, or shifted only extremely slowly, measured in millimeters. Their soft, flattened bodies and large surface areas were not weaknesses, but survival strategies. Their fractal branching shapes, repeating modular patterns from small to large, maximized contact with the surrounding environment. In biophysics, this is one of the most efficient ways to exchange matter, when no specialized organs like guts or circulatory systems exist. For decades, this hypothesis remained controversial due to a lack of direct evidence. But in 2018, a breakthrough discovery emerged. Researchers analyzing fossils of Dickinsonia and Cambrian detected phytosterols, lipid compounds characteristic of algae and microorganisms. This ecosystem functioned like a slow but stable energy network. Oxygen levels in the oceans at the time were lower than today. There was enough oxygen to support slow metabolism, but not enough to drive energy-intensive behaviors such as predation or rapid movement. This is what made Ediacara both fascinating and fragile. Their ecosystem was not built to withstand pressure. Stability persisted long enough for soft, delicate bodies to dominate the planet. But a world without predators would eventually face something it was never prepared to resist. And from that small fracture, The first organisms that broke the silence began to appear, carrying with them the seeds of competition, instability, and an entirely new era. Around 560 to 555 million years ago, in the late Ediacaran sediments, new traces began to appear on the ancient seafloor. No longer just the static impressions of soft bodies, but scratch marks, grazing scars, and directional grooves. They told a different story. Organisms were actively interacting, not only with their environment, but with other organisms themselves. One of the most prominent names is Cambrian. Unlike most Ediacaran organisms, Cambrian displayed bilateral symmetry, a clearly defined front and back, and, most importantly, associated fossils showing parallel scrape marks on microbial mats. Geometric analysis indicates these marks were not random products of currents, but the result of controlled grazing behavior. At the same time, another organism appeared with an entirely new strategy. Cloudina, not soft, not flat. Cloudina built a mineral shell composed of nested calcium carbonate tubes, one of the earliest known examples of biomineralized skeletons. Even more striking, many Cloudina fossils bear circular boreholes of consistent size and shape, indicating attacks by other organisms. In evolutionary biology, biomineralization is an energetically expensive strategy. Without predation pressure, there would be no reason to invest in such heavy armor. Then came Aurora Lumina, described from sediments dated to around 560 million years ago in Newfoundland. With a rigid, branching tubular structure and protrusions resembling tentacles, Aurora Lumina is considered one of the earliest predatory animals ever recorded. Although small in scale and slow in speed, the existence of Aurora Lumina represented an entirely new way of life. From this moment on, the Ediacaran ecosystem was no longer a stable plane. It became a competitive space. Microbial mats were torn apart, soft-bodied organisms became vulnerable. Flattened, immobile bodies, once an advantage, now became a fatal weakness. The greatest danger was not the number of predators, but the speed at which evolutionary pressure spread. Ediacara did not collapse overnight, but from this moment forward, their world had entered a countdown. For Ediacaran organisms, oxygen arrived as an environmental force that changed faster than life itself could adapt, a life that had remained stable for tens of millions of years. By the end of the Neoproterozoic, around 600 to 560 million years ago, geochemical evidence from sulfur, iron, and molybdenum isotopes shows that oxygen levels in both the oceans and the atmosphere began to rise noticeably. This was not a sudden leap like the Great Oxidation Event more than 2 billion years earlier, but an unstable phase of oxygenation, fluctuating sharply across time and space. For modern biology, oxygen is the foundation of efficient metabolism. But for Ediacaran ecosystems, which had evolved under low, stable, and stratified oxygen conditions, this increase was a physiological shock. Oxygen is a highly reactive molecule without mechanisms to control oxidative stress. It damages cell membranes, proteins, and DNA. Sedimentary models and fossil evidence indicate that toward the end of the Ediacaran, shallow oceans could become oxygen-rich for short periods, while deeper seafloor regions slipped into hypoxia or even anoxia. Around 600 million years ago, the ozone layer began to form more clearly as oxygen accumulated in the atmosphere. For Ediacaran organisms, soft and thin-bodied forms that absorb nutrients directly through their surfaces, changes in environmental chemistry were not something they could simply avoid. They had no specialized tissues, no circulatory systems, no strong internal regulation. Their entire bodies were exposed surfaces. Studies of stratigraphic sections in Namibia and Canada show that late Ediacaran environments experienced rapid oxygenation episodes, alternating with low oxygen phases, unfolding over just hundreds of thousands to a few million years, an extremely short time scale in evolutionary terms. These fluctuations caused chronic physiological stress, reducing reproductive success, increasing early mortality, and driving population declines, even in the absence of a clear extinction event. As oxygen levels rose, ocean nutrient cycles also shifted, redistributing phosphorus, iron, and nitrogen, elements essential to life. Microbial mats, the foundation of the Ediacaran ecosystem, began to weaken as they were oxidized and disturbed by mobile organisms. What happens when an ecosystem cannot adapt fast enough? The disappearance of the Ediacaran biosphere was a slow, deep, and silent unraveling. Between roughly 550 and 541 million years ago, during a phase known as the Nama interval, the fossil record reveals a stark reality. 95% of Ediacaran species vanished. This was not a local decline, but a global one. From Namibia to Australia, from Canada to Russia, life forms that had once been widespread, diverse, and stable suddenly left no trace in younger sediments. There is no evidence of a contemporaneous asteroid impact, no sign of a sudden global glaciation like Snowball Earth, no sea level change large enough to explain a mass collapse. Instead, all available data point toward a more complex scenario, a cascade of overlapping pressures. Each factor alone may not have been enough to destroy Ediacara, but together they became unavoidable. First came environmental instability. Carbon and oxygen isotope analyses from Nama sediments show that the climate during this period was significantly less stable than in the early Ediacaran. Ocean temperatures fluctuated, redox cycles accelerated, and seafloor regions repeatedly slipped into hypoxic conditions. For Ediacaran organisms, dependent on passive oxygen diffusion across their body surfaces, even brief episodes of low oxygen could trigger mass mortality. Next came volcanism. Geological evidence indicates that the late Neoproterozoic was a time of intense tectonic activity, with the formation of large igneous provinces. Volcanic eruptions release not only carbon dioxide, but also sulfur dioxide, driving acid rain and acidification of shallow oceans. This acidification was especially dangerous for shallow seafloor ecosystems, where most Ediacaran organisms lived, weakening microbial mats and undermining the energy foundation of the entire ecosystem. But perhaps the most dangerous pressure came from biology itself, rather than geology. The emergence and spread of actively moving organisms, capable of grazing and early predation, during the late Ediacaran fundamentally altered how the oceans functioned. They churned sediments, disrupted microbial mats, released buried organic matter, and reshaped nutrient cycles. This process, known as bioturbation, erased the very habitats on which Ediacaran life depended. Crucially, Ediacaran organisms did not disappear because they were eaten en masse. Most vanished because their environment no longer existed. One key aspect of the Ediacaran decline is that it did not happen all at once. In some regions, a few species persisted longer. In others, the collapse came earlier and faster. The disappearance of Ediacara was not the end of complex life. On the contrary, it was a moment of transition when one kind of biological world gave way to another, harsher, faster, and less forgiving. And in the space Ediacara left behind, a new era was preparing to erupt. As the Ediacaran period came to a close, Earth entered one of the most violent and uncompromising phases in the entire history of life. Around 541 million years ago, the Cambrian boundary opened like an evolutionary acceleration with no brakes. Within a relatively short span on the geological timescale, estimated at just 20 to 25 million years, nearly all of the major animal phyla we recognize today began to appear in the fossil record. This event is known as the Cambrian explosion. Cambrian organisms did not wait for nutrients to drift across their body surfaces. They went out to find food. They did not merely absorb, but pursued, evaded, attacked, and defended. One of the most revolutionary changes was the emergence of skeletons and rigid structures. Calcium phosphate and calcium carbonate began to be used to build shells, spines, protective plates, and internal frameworks. Organisms with hard structures were better able to withstand predation pressure, and at the same time became new threats to species that lacked effective defenses. Alongside this came the evolution of nervous systems and muscles. Fossil evidence shows that Cambrian animals could control movement with greater precision, react more quickly, and display more complex behaviors. The winding crawl marks preserved in early Cambrian sediments, known as trace fossils, reveal that animals were not only moving, but actively searching, exploring, and interacting with their environment in ways that had never existed before. Any Ediacaran organisms that survived into the early Cambrian faced a world utterly foreign to them. Microbial mats, the foundation of their energy supply, were destroyed by bioturbation. The seafloor was constantly churned, oxygen levels were no longer stable, And most importantly, new organisms appeared that did not merely live, but lived by killing other organisms. Genetic studies suggest that many genes controlling body development, such as Hox genes, may have already existed by the late Ediacaran. What changed in the Cambrian was not just the genes themselves, but the environmental conditions that allowed those genes to be strongly expressed. Higher oxygen levels, more dynamic nutrient cycles, and far harsher biological pressures. Each biological innovation triggered a chain reaction. When predators emerged, prey were forced to evolve defenses. As defenses improved, predators had to become faster or more sophisticated. This was a biological arms race, and the Cambrian was where that race truly began. And if the Cambrian was a moment of explosive acceleration, the next question is this: what made it possible for Ediacara to appear in the first place? Between roughly 720 and 635 million years ago, Earth entered a phase known as Snowball Earth. Geological evidence from multiple continents suggests that glaciers may have covered nearly the entire surface of the planet, stretching from the poles to the equator. Global temperatures dropped sharply. The oceans froze over vast areas, and biological cycles nearly ground to a halt. But Snowball Earth was not only a catastrophe, it was an evolutionary bottleneck. A moment when old limits were broken in the most extreme way possible. As Earth's surface became locked in ice, silicate weathering nearly stopped, while volcanic activity continued. Millions of years of sustained eruptions pumped CO2 into the atmosphere, with no effective mechanism to remove it. When CO2 concentrations reached a critical threshold, the ice began to melt, not gradually, but rapidly and violently by geological standards. Climate models suggest that the transition from Snowball Earth to a warmer state may have occurred in just a few thousand years. The oceans were released, sunlight returned, but the most important change was not temperature. Melting ice triggered an intense wave of continental weathering, flushing phosphorus, iron, calcium, and numerous trace elements into the oceans at unprecedented scales. This was a global nutrient pulse, creating shallow marine environments that were resource-rich and stable over long periods. Oxygen levels in the oceans began to rise, though they remained variable. It was within this post-glacial window that Ediacara emerged. This ecosystem formed after a delay, once conditions had stabilized enough to allow large, soft-bodied organisms to grow, live long lives, and thrive without the need for movement. Complex biological pressures, such as predation, competition for space, and seafloor disturbance had not yet fully developed. In that gap, simple but effective survival strategies became viable. Absorbing nutrients across body surfaces, living in association with microbial mats, and growing large to maximize metabolic exchange. Another critical factor was the chemistry of post-snowball Earth oceans. Isotopic studies suggest that these oceans were strongly stratified, oxygen-rich near the surface and oxygen-poor at depth. This created ideal, shallow water zones for Ediacaran organisms, while limiting the intrusion of energy-intensive, mobile life forms. From a distance, Ediacara may seem out of place. But when viewed through the lens of snowball Earth, their existence becomes starkly logical. Evolution does not create life only from opportunity, it creates life from crisis. Snowball Earth destroyed much of the old living world. Yet from those ruins, an entirely new ecosystem was allowed to appear. Not because it was superior, but because it had no competitors. And then, as Earth continued to change, as oxygen rose, as predation emerged, and as the seafloor lost its stillness, that window quietly closed. The Ediacaran period was not merely a forgotten prehistoric chapter, but the first great global laboratory of life. It marked a pivotal moment when solitary cells abandoned isolation and joined together as complex multicellular entities, carrying out early biological experiments in form and body structure. Although most of these strange organisms vanished in a quiet mass extinction, the legacy they left behind was the first blueprint for all the rules of survival that followed. Their disappearance demonstrates that evolution is not a straight path toward perfection, but a journey shaped by constant experimentation and harsh selection. Decoding the mystery of the Ediacaran does more than trace the origins of modern animals. It offers a deeper understanding of how fragile life can be in the face of time. Before the world belonged to giant predators, Earth was once the stage for silent, motionless beings, reminding us that this planet's history holds chapters far more profound and mysterious than we can easily imagine. Thank you for staying with WUFO Space until the very end of this journey through the vast universe. If you found this video interesting and insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to WUFO Space so you won't miss our next cosmic adventures. Your support means the world to us and fuels our passion to keep exploring the wonders beyond.